Hello again, my name is Steve Hillis, and we're going to continue our discussion of major sociological theories. Here we're going to focus on functionalism, more specifically what has been called functional logic or functional analysis. Functional logic was a very popular approach to theoretical arguments made by functionalists. It was based on a core assumption. The core assumption was that any persistent, large-scale social phenomena contributes positively to society. Now, let's take a step back. Persistent social phenomena, something that people keep doing over and over again for years, decades, perhaps generations. Large-scale social phenomena. Well, lots of people do it, perhaps entire societies. Maybe it's something that's commonly found across many societies. The more persistent a phenomenon is, and the more people engage in it, presumably the more applicable functional logic is to that particular topic or subject. Now, functional logic can be looked at in a slightly different way, a way that's, I think, totally consistent. Robert Merton basically defined functional analysis in terms of analyzing something in terms of its consequences for the larger society. For him, that's what a function was. It was a consequence, an effect or side effect. Now, really what he was saying is that, well, let's just take a concrete example. It might be a little easier to understand. Say you're going to do a functional analysis of religion. Well, you try to discover its functions or consequences, how it contributes in a positive way to the larger society. Now, Merton might have also looked at what he called dysfunctions, the negative consequences as well. But he, and frankly most other functionalists, would have paid a lot more attention to the positive consequences of religion. Because for them, that's why religion existed in the first place. Exactly because in the big picture, in the long run, it contributed more positive consequences than negative consequences for the larger society. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been there. In a sense, societies need religion. The job of the functional analyst was to identify the functions of religion for the larger society, to identify its major consequences. If you put on your thinking cap, you can do the exercise too. All it requires is a little imagination and a little time. What are the functions or consequences of religion? Think about it. Presumably, you can come up with a very long list. Presumably, religion contributes to more stable families. It bonds families and communities together. It gives people shared values. It encourages moral behavior, producing, at least indirectly, more social stability and cohesion. Presumably, religion encourages people to have hope, gives them meaning in social life. It provides motivation for all sorts of social activity. It allows people to be more productive and more cooperative with one another. You can begin to extend this thinking as far as you want to. Ideally, you'd want to identify all, or at least most, of the critical, important functions of religion for the larger society. The more, the better. And the more specific you could be, the better. And the more evidence you could provide to back up these suppositions, the better. Basically, what you'd be doing is a functional analysis, explaining the existence, the persistence of religion in terms of its consequences. And by doing so, you get a sense of why we have religion, how it works, why it's there, and what might go wrong if religion weakened or began to break down. Now, functionalist logic can be applied to a wide range of other topics. Religion was just one example. We could apply it to marriage, family, education. The list goes on and on. But it's not just the obvious, the G-rated examples that we need to pay attention to, because functionalists often applied functional logic to behavior that was very controversial, perhaps immoral, often criminal or illegal behavior. They commonly did functional analysis of things like crime, violence, prostitution, alcohol abuse, and so forth. Those things also were persistent, large-scale social phenomena. They weren't just saying that society benefits by things like marriage or education. They weren't just saying society needs religion. They were saying society needs organized crime. Society needs alcoholism, or at least alcohol use. society needs or benefits by all sorts of persistent large-scale social phenomena, even if they're controversial and even if they cause some problems. Functionalists realized that some of these social phenomena did create various social problems. They realized they produced what we might call dysfunctions, negative consequences, but they firmly believed that in the long run, in the big picture, the positive functions were dominant. The positive consequences outweighed, were more important, were stronger than the negative consequences. Otherwise, those phenomena wouldn't have existed in the first place, or at least they wouldn't have persisted. Now, functionalists sometimes could be very inventive in their functional analysis. They didn't just focus on the most obvious or simplest functions or consequences when analyzing a social phenomenon. Oftentimes, they looked at things that were far more subtle, complex, counterintuitive, abstract. A really good functional analysis would look for very highly indirect consequences of social behavior in terms of better understanding it. Think about it this way. Social practices, patterns of social activity, large-scale social phenomena produce webs and waves of social consequences. The better you understand these consequences, the more consequences you understand, the farther you work your way down the web of consequences, the more you understand what's going on and how it basically is shaping societies and the way they work. Now, functionalists also would argue that functional analysis gave you many other insights, but we unfortunately don't have time to get into all these details. For right now, I'd like to move on and talk just a little bit about some of the possible problems with functional analysis. Because functional analysis, frankly, has had lots of critics. And some people will claim that one of the basic flaws in functionalism was functional logic. Some people will claim that really it wasn't all that logical to begin with, but more on that in a minute. Some critics suggested that it was, well, too conservative. Functionalists were too ready, too willing to defend the status quo. That it really was a philosophy and a theory that was, whether they intended to or not, something that justified the current social system. Other people had some serious doubts about the moral implications of functionalism. All that stuff about the functions of crime and violence and prostitution, the idea that society needs the sex industry, otherwise it wouldn't persist. Those kinds of arguments strike moral conservatives often as ludicrous or highly controversial. And they challenge the underlying assumptions as well. At the same time, I'll point out that functional logic does invite quite a bit of speculation. I mean, after all, you can put on your thinking cap and you too can come up with an endless string of possible functions or consequences of whatever you're analyzing. In some ways, it's too easy. The bottom line is it probably does invite a lot of, well, unwarranted, unsound speculation, especially if you do it poorly. More fundamentally, some people argue that functional logic is tautological, a fancy philosophical term meaning circular thinking. It's like a dog chasing its own tail. It assumes what it appears to prove, or what it proves it's already assumed. If society is organized a certain way, if you see certain persistent large-scale social phenomena, they must be functional. On the other hand, if something's functional, it'll exist. Or at least that's what a lot of functionalists seem to be arguing. Well, again, a lot of critics were arguing that really they were kind of proving what they'd already assumed, or assuming what they intended to prove. Really, it was an exercise in illogic. It was an exercise that spun around in circles and went nowhere. And finally, some other people argued that maybe because of that, or for other reasons, functionalist arguments were basically untestable, non-falsifiable, unscientific. I mean, after all, how could you actually go out and test the argument that, say, religion was functional for society? Well, at the very least, that would be an extremely difficult thing to test. Now, there was a lot more to functionalism than just functional logic. And in our next tape, we're going to talk about some of the core concerns and focuses of functionalism beyond functional logic. But we'll deal with that next time. Thank you very much.